Frank Sinatra was mocking Dean Martin's lightweight singing when he jokingly said, "Try some real opera." What Dean did next left Frank in tears and revealed a side of his closest friend that he never knew existed, proving that sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones who surprise us most. It was November 14, 1964, and the recording studio at Capitol Records on North Vine Street in Hollywood was alive with the controlled chaos of creativity. Studio A, normally reserved for the label's biggest stars, had been booked for what the session sheets euphemistically called experimental recordings, which was Capitol's way of saying that Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin had decided to spend an evening making music for the pure joy of it, with no commercial pressure and no executives looking over their shoulders. The Rat Pack was at the height of their cultural dominance. Frank was the chairman of the board, the man who could make or break careers with a single word. Dean was the king of cool, the entertainer whose effortless charm had made him one of America's most beloved performers. Together, they represented the pinnacle of American popular music, two voices that had defined an entire generation's understanding of sophistication and style. But tonight, in Studio A, they were just Frank and Dino, two friends who had discovered that their voices blended together in ways that surprised even them, and who had talked Capitol into giving them studio time to explore whatever musical directions their conversation might take them. The session had been going for 3 hours, and they'd recorded loose, informal versions of standards they both knew by heart. "The Way You Look Tonight," "I've Got You Under My Skin," "Come Fly With Me," songs they could sing in their sleep, but tonight were approaching with the playful experimentation of musicians who trusted each other completely. Frank sat at the piano, his sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened, playing chord progressions with the casual mastery of someone who understood music from the inside out. Dean leaned against the piano, a glass of what looked like whiskey but was actually apple juice. Dean had been quietly sober for 2 years, though almost nobody knew, listening to Frank's musical ideas with the focused attention he brought to things that genuinely interested him. The recording engineer, a young man named Pete Walters who had been working with both singers for several years, sat behind the console with the relaxed alertness of someone who knew he was witnessing something special but professional enough not to let his excitement interfere with his work. "You know what your problem is, Dino?" Frank said, his fingers finding a complex jazz chord that seemed to hang in the air like expensive perfume. "You make everything sound too easy. People think you're just coasting on charm." Dean smiled, that characteristic expression that suggested he found something amusing in Frank's observation. "And that's a problem because they don't take you seriously as a vocalist. They think you're just a personality who happens to sing, not a real singer who happens to have personality." Frank played a few more chords, building an argument through music. "Take me, for instance. When I sing a ballad, people know they're hearing technique. They hear the breath control, the phrasing, the way I use silence. They know there's craft behind the emotion." Dean nodded, acknowledging the point without necessarily agreeing with it. "And when I sing a ballad?" "When you sing a ballad, people think you just walked into the studio and happened to sound good. They don't hear the work." It wasn't criticism exactly, but it wasn't entirely friendly either. There had always been a subtle competitive undercurrent in their friendship, the natural tension between two men who were both at the top of their profession and who genuinely respected each other but weren't immune to comparing their artistic approaches. "So what are you saying, Frank?" Frank's fingers moved to a different progression, something more classical, more formal. "I'm saying that your whole casual thing works great for the material you do, but if you had to sing something that really required technical skill, something with real musical demands." He let the sentence hang there, the implication clear without being directly stated. Dean's smile widened slightly, but there was something different behind it now. Something that Pete, watching from the control room, recognized as the expression Dean got when someone had inadvertently touched on a subject he cared about more than he usually let on. "Something like what?" Dean asked. Frank played a dramatic chord, the kind that belonged in opera houses and concert halls rather than recording studios and nightclubs. Something like real opera. Verdi, Puccini, the stuff that separates the men from the boys, the stuff that requires— Frank paused, searching for the right word. Gravitas, weight, the kind of vocal authority that you can't fake. Pete leaned forward in his chair, sensing that the conversation had shifted from casual banter to something more serious, though he couldn't yet see where it was heading. Dean pushed off from the piano and walked to the center of the studio, his movements unhurried but purposeful. "You think I couldn't handle opera?" Frank laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that was meant to take the edge off a statement that might have cut deeper than intended. "Dino, come on. Opera's a different animal entirely. It's not about being smooth or charming or making people feel comfortable. It's about power, about technique, about—" He gestured toward the air as if he could pull the right words out of it. "It's about suffering, you know? About using your voice to express things that are too big for regular conversation." Dean was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quality that Pete had never heard from him before. Something more serious, more personal. "You want me to try some opera, Frank?" Frank's hands paused over the keys. Something in Dean's tone had registered as significant, though Frank couldn't quite identify what it was. "I was just making conversation, pal. I didn't mean—" "No, seriously. You think opera requires something I don't have? Pick something. Anything. Let's find out." The challenge hung in the air between them, and Pete found himself holding his breath without realizing why. Frank studied Dean's face, looking for signs of whether this was still part of their usual playful back and forth, or whether something more serious was developing. "Dino, I wasn't trying to insult you. I just think different kinds of music require different kinds of voices." "Then prove it," Dean said simply. "Pick an area. Something that requires all that technical skill and gravitas you're talking about. Let's see what happens." Frank sat back from the piano, clearly uncertain about how to proceed. He'd started this conversation as friendly teasing, but Dean had turned it into something that felt like an actual test. "All right," Frank said slowly. "But don't get upset if it doesn't work out. Opera's not your lane, and there's nothing wrong with that." Dean nodded, accepting the disclaimer without comment. Frank thought for a moment, then his fingers found the opening notes of Nessun Dorma, the aria from Puccini's Turandot that was considered one of the most challenging pieces in the tenor repertoire. It was a song about love and determination and the willingness to risk everything for what you believed in, and it required a combination of power, control, and emotional depth that few singers could master. "This is Nessun Dorma," Frank said. "It's probably the most famous tenor aria in all of opera. It's—" He paused, realizing he was about to explain why Dean wouldn't be able to sing it, which seemed unnecessarily cruel. "It's a beautiful piece." Dean nodded and moved to the microphone, adjusting it to the proper height with movements that seemed more purposeful than his usual casual gestures. "Start from the beginning," Dean said. Frank played the opening notes, the melody that had been moving audiences to tears for 70 years, and Dean began to sing. What came out of the studio monitors wasn't the Dean Martin that Frank thought he knew. Dean's voice, which Frank had always heard as warm and conversational and effortlessly charming, was suddenly something else entirely. It was still warm, but now it carried weight, authority, the kind of power that seemed to come from someplace deeper than technique or training. He sang the opening lines in Italian, his pronunciation perfect, his phrasing sophisticated, his understanding of the music's emotional architecture complete and intuitive. Pete watched Frank's expression change as the aria progressed. The casual amusement faded first, replaced by surprise, then by something approaching awe. Dean's voice soared through the challenging passages that Frank had expected would expose his limitations. Instead, they revealed capabilities that Frank hadn't known existed. This wasn't a pop singer trying to fake his way through classical music. This was a trained vocalist who had simply been choosing to use only a portion of his abilities for most of his career. When Dean reached the aria's climactic moment, the phrase, "vincerò," that required every ounce of power and control a singer could summon, his voice filled the studio with a sound that Pete had never heard from any recording session he'd ever engineered. It was Dean Martin's voice, unmistakably, but transformed into something that belonged in the world's greatest opera houses. The technique was flawless, but more than that, the emotion was profound, authentic, the sound of someone who understood exactly what the music was trying to express and had the ability to express it fully. When Dean finished, The studio was completely silent. Frank's hands were still on the piano keys, but he wasn't playing. He was staring at Dean with the expression of someone whose fundamental understanding of reality had just been quietly but completely revised. Pete looked through the control room window and saw that Frank's eyes were bright with tears that hadn't quite begun to fall. "Jesus Christ, Dino," Frank said quietly. "Where did that come from?" Dean straightened his tie, a small gesture that seemed to transition him back into his usual casual persona. "My grandmother," he said simply. "She was from Abruzzo, in Italy. She'd been trained as an opera singer before she came to America. She taught me when I was a kid, but I never told anybody because it didn't fit the image." Frank stood up from the piano bench, shaking his head slowly. "You've been able to sing like that this whole time?" "I've been working on it, taking lessons when I could, practicing when nobody was around. But it never seemed like something that would work with the kind of career I wanted." Frank walked over to where Dean was standing and put his hands on his friend's shoulders. "Dino, that was one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. And I've heard everybody." Dean smiled, but it was a different smile now, more open, more vulnerable than his usual charming expression. "I've been wanting to record something like that for years, but I was afraid people would think I was putting on airs, trying to be something I'm not." Frank's eyes were definitely wet now, and he made no attempt to hide it. "That's the thing, though. You weren't trying to be something you're not. That was you. That was really you. Maybe more than anything else you've ever done." Pete, watching from the control room, realized he had just witnessed something that transcended entertainment or even artistry. He had watched one friend discover something profound about another friend, something that changed their understanding of each other in ways that would probably affect their friendship for the rest of their lives. Frank turned to the control room window. "Pete, please tell me you were recording that." Pete nodded, his own voice slightly thick with emotion. "Everything's on tape, Mr. Sinatra." "Good," Frank said. "Because that needs to be preserved. That's not just a performance, that's—" He struggled for the right word. "That's a revelation." Dean laughed, and the sound carried both relief and gratitude. "So you think maybe people would want to hear me do some classical material?" Frank's response came without hesitation. "Dino, if you recorded an album of opera arias, it would be the most important vocal album of the decade, maybe longer." They spent the next 2 hours recording 3 more classical pieces, with Frank accompanying Dean on piano and both men exploring musical territory they had never shared before. The session ended with both singers understanding something about their friendship and their artistry that they hadn't known when the evening began. Years later, when music historians studied the development of American popular music, they would point to that November evening as a pivotal moment when the boundaries between popular and classical music proved to be far more fluid than anyone had imagined. The recordings from that session were never commercially released during Dean's lifetime, at his request. He felt they were too personal, too revealing of parts of himself that he preferred to keep private. But Frank kept the tapes, and sometimes, late at night in his own home, he would play them and remember the evening when he discovered that his best friend was not just a great entertainer, but one of the finest natural vocalists he had ever heard. If this story of hidden talent and deepened friendship moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Share this with anyone who needs to know that the people closest to us can still surprise us in the most beautiful ways. Have you ever discovered something unexpected about someone you thought you knew completely? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible stories about the hidden depths of music's greatest legends.